Hi and welcome to 3 Minutes On. This week we have Tim Collins, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of War Studies at King's College London, talking to us about Trident.
What actually is Trident? So the word is actually slightly a misnomer. Technically, Trident refers to the missile that carries Britain's nuclear weapon. Those missiles, however, are carried on 4 Vanguard-class submarines. Those submarines are nearing the end of their planned life, so at the moment Britain is in the middle of deciding whether or not to replace those submarines. Generally, though, we just refer to this as the Trident renewal debate. Probably the most important detail is cost. How much is this actually going to cost? There's two sides to that issue, of course. The government argues that Vanguard renewal is going to cost around £31 billion. In addition, Trident needs a yearly operating budget to keep everything working properly. That is likely to be in the region of £2 to £3 billion, as with the current submarines. Critics challenge some of these costs. Firstly, they challenge whether or not the costs are accurate. You'll see a figure that's sometimes quoted of anything between 100 billion and 160 billion. I think it's important to note, however, that both the government and critics are kind of guilty of presenting costs in a way that are favourable to their arguments. Critics kind of add up the whole life of the cost across 40 years. Equally, the government divides it into yearly increments. So if that's how much it's going to cost, why keep it or not? So the government argues that Trident is an important capability for Britain to have. Specifically, they argue that nuclear weapons are important in protecting Britain. Obviously, Britain is currently a member of NATO, which includes the United States. The government, however, argues that the future is inherently uncertain, and yes, while we are currently a member of this large alliance, it might be important 30 or 40 years in the future for Britain to have its own nuclear capability in order to be able to protect itself. Critics challenge this. Firstly, some people challenge whether or not nuclear weapons actually deter anything. Another criticism is because Britain leases the missiles from the United States, they challenge that this is actually a capability that the United States might be able to turn off if ever it wanted. From a technical point of view, that argument doesn't really stand up, but that is something that's often repeated a lot in the media. So those are the arguments that are offered publicly. Of course, there's also private issues. There's the idea of prestige, so whether or not Britain's nuclear status matters for its standing in the world. Critics say that one of the reasons Britain wants to keep these weapons is kind of as a status symbol. Some people also raise the question, if Britain got rid of its weapons, would it lose its seat on the UN Security Council? What would it do to our relationship with the United States? There's also domestic politics to consider. It used to be that Conservatives and Labour basically agreed on this issue. They were both in support of renewal. It was Tony Blair's Labour government that started this process. Obviously, the election of Jeremy Corbyn has thrown that into some kind of disarray. There's also the issue of Scotland to consider. The submarines are based in Faslane Naval Base. The SNP are openly and universally opposed to nuclear weapons in general and in Scotland specifically. So whatever you think of the arguments, I think it's also important to consider what is it like for MPs who actually have to decide on this issue. When you talk privately to lots of MPs, lots of them are actually quite torn on this issue. It's a moral issue. I'm an academic. If I'm wrong on Trident, nothing really happens to me. Politicians, though, have to think that if they're wrong and they get rid of this weapon, what happens if Britain one day needs it?
Thanks, Tim. If you'd like to speak for 3 minutes on something, email Amy at 3minuteson.com with your idea, or if there's a topic you think we should be covering, let me know in the comments. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and hit subscribe for new videos every Tuesday.